My name is Cheryl McClenny, and I'm from the National Endowment for the Humanities, but I'm here in a different capacity this morning with the pleasure of introducing our speaker. You'll hear more from me later today on my own work. Gordon McKay Ambach is a native of Providence, Rhode Island. He did his undergraduate and graduate work at Yale and Harvard universities, respectively. Mr. Ambach's career in the field of education spans a variety of professional teaching and administrative assignments, including teaching at the secondary and university level and administration in planning, policy development, and management in state, federal, and local education agencies. His federal assignments have included 4 years in Washington with the U.S. Office of Education and service under 5 U.S. Commissioners of Education. Recently, Commissioner Ambach served as a delegate to the White House Conference on Libraries and as a member of the Resolutions Committee to that conference. Prior to his current appointment, Mr. Ambach served as the New York State Education Department's Deputy Executive Commissioner. He was appointed by the State Board of Regents as President of the University of the State of New York and Commissioner of Education on July 1st, 1977. I'm pleased to introduce to all of you Commissioner Gordon Ambach.
Thank you very kindly, Cheryl, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I've never been at this convention before, or one of its predecessors, and it's a great privilege for me to be here. I especially appreciate the opportunity to say thank you to you, all of you who are involved with museums, and for all of the pleasure that you have given to me and to my family. Our family is in short a part of the breed of museum nuts. Most of my own continuing education, except for that which I get directly related to my occupation, in fact takes place either in museums or at historical sites. Our family knows and loves such places as Hyde Park and the Corning Museum of Glass and the Albright Knox Gallery and the Everson and the Bronx Botanical Gardens, all places familiar to you in New York. And in this area where we spent certain time, the Gardner, the Museum of Fine Arts, the Science Museum and the Children's Museum, all well familiar to my children and to me. In The Priceless Heritage, The Future of Museums, Ian Finley states, the most positive purpose of the museum is to stimulate curiosity, pleasure, even awe by confrontation with the works of nature and of man, through this route to rouse the hunger for knowledge and to give guidance about how it can be satisfied. Each place that I've mentioned has provided us with an opportunity to test our capacity to discriminate and to judge. For good museum presentations teach us the discipline and judgment to decide what is most worth saving and preserving as a part of our heritage. And so it's a pleasure to be able to thank you all personally for what you do for our family and for all of us in America and in Canada who are concerned with our culture. I had occasion to check in one of my top bureau drawers just a couple of days ago, and I found there a ticket stub which happened to be from a shoe repair place. We'd moved 4 years back, and I had forgotten ever to cash in my chip or my stub to get the shoes back. Just simply forgotten about it. Well, I took this stub because I thought I'd test out the cobbler back to the shoe repair place. I presented it to him, and I said, do you happen to have these shoes? Well, he took the stub and he went back and checked the shelves, and he finally came out after a while and he said, yes, I have the shoes. And I said, fine, are they all ready? And he said, they'll be ready next Tuesday. What I'd like to talk about this morning is being sure that we're not always saying, let's be ready next Tuesday. I'd like to talk a bit about networking, and I'd like to use some analogies from other areas of cultural and educational institutions in the hopes that there might be something in those other experiences that is helpful. When I've talked about networking before, I've heard comments from various people saying, well, what networking really means is setting traps and layers for your competitors, all in the good name of cooperation. But I really think it goes beyond just that. And as I said, while not an expert in museum operations, I have, in my experiences with our state education agency, had considerable operations responsibility for our own state museum, and also for the development of public policy for funding and for operations of many cultural institutions, including libraries, public television, historical societies, and others. The analogies of networking or cooperation in these areas and with education, both higher education and elementary and secondary education, may not be exact, but I do hope that they might be useful to you. Very often in one area, what seems to be either difficult to attain or unattainable is common practice in another area. And it's often much easier to look over to some other area and steal or borrow an idea than it is to try to invent it anew in the area in which you're most accustomed to working. Well, my focus is primarily from examples in New York State and on the United States. I certainly want to acknowledge those who are attending this conference from Canada and to extend a very special greeting to our Canadian colleagues. Their participation adds an international dimension to all of our deliberations. I know that the National Museums of Canada incorporate in a single administrative agency the 4 major national museums. The agency has established a nationwide network of associate museums and exhibition centers and a national programs division. And I hope that in the context of thinking about networks as we do this morning, that we may learn a great deal from our Canadian colleagues as we wrestle with similar kinds of cooperative or networking problems here in the States. As we meet at the beginning of this decade, it's certainly appropriate to review what has been past progress and to make some estimates about the 1980s. It's an annual sport, or it's a sport at least, at the beginning of each decade, that this artificial setup of 10-year periods does provide us the kind of reflective point. And as we do it at this time, looking toward the 80s, we can sense that the social, the economic, the intellectual conditions which influenced museum policy and action of the 70s are certainly going to change. And we had better address those changes. A part of the vision for the 80s must emphasize the role of museums as educational institutions. Museums have been recognized as educational in character since the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts back in 1870. The charter of the Metropolitan states that it was to be established for the purpose of, quote, encouraging and developing the study of fine arts and the application of arts to manufacture and practical life, of advancing the general knowledge in kindred subjects, and to that end, of furnishing popular instruction, end quote. The Museum of Fine Arts was chartered, quote, for the purpose of erecting a museum for the preservation and exhibition of works of art, of making, maintaining, and establishing collections of such works, and of affording instruction in the fine arts, end quote. To collect, preserve, to exhibit, and to educate, 4 basic museum functions were delineated clearly more than 100 years ago. In New York State, museums are linked to education by both tradition and law. May I first give a brief overview of our structure and our agency, as it provides a unique model for the integration of all aspects of education. All educational activities in New York State are a part of what we call the University of the State of New York. The term university is here used in a different sense from that commonly employed. And I'm not talking about State University of New York, which is a specific higher education institution. I'm talking about the University of the State of New York. It's a broad term, and it encompasses all of the educational institutions in the state, both public and private, within a unified system of education. This university was established by the New York State Legislature in 1784, and it comprises the oldest continuous state agency in the United States. The governing body for the University of the State of New York is the Board of Regents, more famous to many for regents' examinations, perhaps, than for other functions which they perform. As the Commissioner of Education, I'm their Chief Executive Officer, and I also have the title of President of the University of the State of New York. This university was conceived as a universal system of education. It still provides the most comprehensive network in the country, encompassing all education from pre-kindergarten to postgraduate, from formal academic to informal self-directed learning programs. It includes all of the public and private schools, elementary and secondary, all of the public and independent colleges and universities, the public libraries, the museums and historical societies. The regents may include in the university any institution or association in the promotion of education, literature, science, art, or similar purposes which they deem worthy of their recognition. This then is the setting for our particular concern for museums. We have a very direct responsibility for the development for museums in New York State because they are an integral part of the state's overall educational system. In addition to the statewide responsibility of the university and the department, our department operates the State Museum in Albany, which is the largest state museum in the United States. There are more than 500 museums in New York State. Last year, attendance approached 30 million. The museums employ more than 15,000 people, 5,200 of them full-time, and their budgets exceed $100 million annually. That's a very large enterprise. One of our major goals in the department has been to encourage and to establish connections among various parts of our university. We have used an approach of regional conferences and discussions in particular to do this, with the invitation of representatives from all different parts of the university, from the museums and libraries and the school system, to join with us in different parts of our state and to speak specifically about the ways in which they might find stronger coordination. I mention that because it's a relatively simple step, but it's an extremely important step by way of striking up that communication which is necessary to lead to all kinds of separate arrangements and contracts, which in fact have come about from the various representatives meeting in that setting. 10 years ago, the American Association of Museums, in response to a request from the federal government for advice on the status and needs of museums, published the Belmont Report. This landmark document addressed three questions. What's the present condition? What are the unmet needs of American museums? What's the relation to other cultural and educational institutions? The Belmont Report proves to be a most successful vehicle for focusing the attention of the federal government on the museums of the nation. The report became a broad guideline for federal action regarding museums through the 1970s. The specific results of the report were the funding of the National Museum Act to its present level, and most important, the establishment of the Institute of Museum Services, and the acceptance of the principle that the federal government should provide through the Institute general operating support for museums in addition to the project support available from NEA, NEH, and the National Science Foundation. In 1969, when the Belmont Report was published, neither inflation nor the ever-rising cost of energy was foreseen as reaching its present critical state. The vast increase in the cost of energy scarcely was thought of at all, let alone anticipated as a major national issue. Energy costs are not just an ever-increasing drain on institutional operating budgets, which shortchange programs. Concern for the availability and the cost of fuel causes a decline in museum attendance. In the '74 energy crisis, more than half of the museums in the United States reported declines in attendance. A particular concern then, as now, is the impact of energy supplies and costs on the ability of the schools to continue to sponsor field trips to museums and other general transportation issues. I simply use that as one illustration of a change in circumstance. And yet, in spite of that problem during the course of the '70s, if you look in the aggregate at museum activity, it increased in just about every dimension. Overall, during the 1970s, attendance was higher, with more extensive work with colleges and universities and with the schools. There were increases in collections and generally in systems of cooperation. But as we think about the 1980s, not only its dimensions of inflation of energy problems, I invite you this morning to think a bit about the museums in a broader context of educational development. To do this, let me quickly draw a sketch of some of the most significant changes that will occur in the other educational institutions. And I turn now to demographic considerations. From the end of World War II until 1970, all aspects of formal education grew. Higher education continued to grow in the 1970s, and indeed peak enrollments in higher education are just about now for most institutions. This decade will be very different. We are in the middle of a 20-year decline in the numbers of students in the elementary and secondary schools. In 1970, for example, in New York State, there were 4.3 million students in the schools. And we project that by 1990, there will be 2.8 million children in the schools. A decline of 1.5 million in attendance in a period of some 20 years. That represents a 35% decrease. Nationally, there were 60 million students in 1970. We project 52 million students by 1990. Canada will experience a sharp decline also, from 5.8 million in '70 to 4.6 million in 1990. Very, very substantial changes in numbers. May I note at this point, incidentally, that I've been so pretentious to make copies of this statement this morning, and if any of you are interested in these figures or anything that I have to say, copies would be available to you at the end of the session. Let's look at undergraduate enrollment. Total full-time undergraduate enrollment in our state of New York will decline. Between '78 and '94, we project a decline of 25 to 35%. Nationally, a decline of 15 to 20% is looked for. However, one must also look at the change in adults, and this comes to the point of these statistics. Adults are moving to colleges by the millions. The result that approximately 1/3 of all students in higher education are now 25 years or older, and by 1980, 40% of all students in higher education will be 25 years and older, and that trend will continue. As we increase in this country in our older population, I suspect that what we will do is to increase on the demands of museums for their educational services. We will do so not only because it is the older populations who tend to use them, but also because of a change in view about education. It's been widely assumed that only children change and that adults merely age. One student of the subject, prevailing opinion continues to be, and I quote, "Like a butterfly, an An adult is supposed to emerge fully formed and on cue after a succession of developmental stages in childhood. Equipped with all the accoutrements such as wisdom and rationality, the adult supposedly remains quiescent for another half-century or so. Close quote. We're not as familiar as we ought to be with the profound psychological and physiological changes that take place during adult years. Several scholars have suggested clearly discernible stages. You're well familiar with them, I'm sure. And yet when we look at what we do by way of policy considerations, we very seldom take these into account. The late Lionel Trilling sensed the dimensions of unfolding adult life, which he expressed in a thought-provoking way. Trilling used to say that people don't read books, books read people. He explained this reversal of the usual order in the following quote: "I have been read by Eliot's poems and by Ulysses and by Remembrance of Things Past and by The Castle for a good many years now, since early youth. Some of these books at first rejected me. I bored them. But as I grew older, they came to have more sympathy with me and to understand my hidden meanings." Close quote. The point Trilling has made applies not only to liberal learning. It suggests that all learning has its proper season. We may not always pursue the right kind of learning at the right time, but the worst we could do would be to keep thinking that the right time was invariably behind us. We must continually encourage the development of our unique human capacity to learn throughout life. As the playwright Christopher Fry notes, the first of our senses which we should take care never to let rust through disuse is that sixth sense, the imagination. I mean the wide-open eye which leads us always to see truth vividly, to apprehend more broadly, to concern ourselves more deeply, to be all our life long sensitive and awake to the powers and responsibilities given to us as human beings. Ingenuity has provided for the variety of interests and needs adults have in education. Education in the adult years may or may not be directed toward a career. It doesn't necessarily lead to academic credit. It often involves short-term commitments of time rather than traditional measures. And as I suggested a few moments ago, I think there is no doubt but that this surge for adult education is going to be felt most directly in cultural institutions such as museums. How then to prepare for this? How then to meet this kind of challenge at the same time when each one of you, as we are in our agency, is wrestling with horrendous problems about budgets, about resources, and trying to plan to use those scarce resources? I'm afraid I have to believe that we must be conservative about the continuing availability of public resources. It's not that we won't continue to try and to advance as vigorously as possible the cause for the allocation of a proper share of our public resource for museums and other cultural resources. But in fact, we are looking at very severe economic issues in this nation, and I cannot be but conservative on that. We look then to what else may be done. And I think as we do so, we must look for similarities among the different types of institutions. All cultural and educational institutions share a similarity of function. We're all involved in a systematic collection and storage, retrieval and dissemination of information, whether it be in 2- or 3-dimensional form. We all seek to both preserve traditional knowledge and generate new knowledge. With this parallel of core functions in mind, I would like to share some experiences that have been found in other areas by way of collaboration or of networking. First, a mention of the area of libraries. I noted that we had in our own agency a responsibility for the State Library of New York, which incidentally is a library of some 4.5 to 5 million items, the largest of the state libraries and among the 93 largest research libraries in this nation. That library, together with the other libraries throughout the state, forms a very unique kind of network, which provides, I think, some instructive lessons for museums. We look at the national level. Late last year, representatives of all of the different libraries met in Washington in the White House conference. A 15-year planning effort, I might note, not something that came up in 1 or 2 years, but a 15-year timetable to develop that conference, which in fact brought together citizens and professionals in a national focus on the most important issues to be addressed for libraries and information systems. Museums need no less a forum, no less public participation in setting the agenda for action, no less public agreement on their purposes and value for our nation. And I would invite you, if you're interested in looking at the comparison, to take a look at some of the documents which were produced by that White House conference, and certainly some of the recommendations that were made with respect to both federal, state, and local actions. While on the federal issue, may I note the first of the suggestions that I have specifically to make. This has to do with the federal organization for museum activity. Not too long back, the Congress enacted a statute which created a U.S. Department of Education. The department, in fact, began operation in early May. The enabling legislation provides no recognition whatsoever for the role of cultural institutions. As a matter of fact, the legislation states that the Secretary may alter, consolidate, or discontinue the Office of Libraries and Learning Resources and the Institute of Museum Services with 90 days notice to the Senate Committee for Labor and Human Resources and the House Committee for Education and Labor. Now, in fact, that hasn't happened. That is, there hasn't been any resolution to discontinue. Indeed, Secretary Hofstadter has committed herself to maintaining a direct reporting relationship with the Institute for Museums Director, and in fact, there is an incorporation in a part of that office of the library and library construction and other cultural education services. But the creation of this department, it seems to me, provides an opportunity which goes far beyond what has in fact happened in that initial enabling statute and what has happened in fact by way of administrative action. It provides an option for the consolidation of certain interests in museums and cultural institutions in a much more clearly defined and potent role within that department. I'm speaking specifically of a proposal that there be organized within that department, under the directorship of an assistant secretary, an Office of Cultural Institutions, which would in fact draw together certain of the federal interests, both domestic and foreign, in this agency. Programs within the Department of Education that would be included in this office would be the Institute for Museum Services, programs under the Library Service and Construction Act, programs concerned with instructional radio, television, and international education and the arts, major programs and offices outside the department that could be consolidated include portions of the International Communication Agency, the National Archives, including the National Audiovisual Center, and certain programs in the Public Broadcasting Corporation that would be better administered through the proposed office. Consolidation of programs in this way would bring together approximately $500 million annually in federal funding for cultural institutions and activities which are now of interest to the federal government. May I note, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, in my judgment, should not be incorporated within such an arrangement. They are properly placed where they are at this point, but there should be a very special relationship established between those major institutions and this kind of internal office I'm suggesting within the Department of Education. Federal activities concerning cultural institutions would, through this, in my view, have a much stronger voice and opportunity for policy formation, by way of having that direct reporting line to the cabinet officer, which of course in turn is a reporting line to the president. I know that Secretary Hustetler will be at this session, and tomorrow I think you want to be listening with great care as to her comments on the current organizational arrangement and what is in fact in store by way of an approach toward the future within that agency. Obviously, I would urge your consideration of the kind of consolidation and thrust I've just discussed. It is, in my view, very directly connected with the whole concept of networking, or of trying to string together in a much better way the resources at our different levels of public agencies. The second specific suggestion which I would like to make to you is to increase joint or collaborative planning at the state, the provincial, or regional levels. Many types of educational institutions are addressing the facts of limited resources and greater demands for expanded services by focusing on joint planning efforts. With the diversity represented here by the museums in the United States and Canada, it's not sensible to try to prescribe what each institution might be doing in the next decade, or to suggest an approach for individual museums. There is an individual integrity that must be maintained, and any kind of planning structure has got to recognize that. Take a look at what's been done in some other areas. The area of higher education, for example, where I can assure you institutions are just as fiercely guarding their institutional autonomy and independence as are museums. In our state, over a 20-year period, there has developed a planning process, quadrennial plans, which are extremely important for both the public and the independent institutions. A planning structure that I described earlier, through which the regents approve and then move on to the legislature and to the governor those overall plans for development. And the value of them is that it gives you an indication of what is an overall resource for a political entity and how it's distributed, but perhaps even more important, from that kind of planning, each institution may examine its own particular mission or objectives against what is a larger set of objectives for all of the institutions collectively. And as one tries to make decisions in the next 10 years by a way of focusing on strengths or reducing weaknesses, it is absolutely essential to be able to look at one's neighboring institutions and determine exactly what should be the focus of each. That's happened in higher education, at least in our state. A second example is with the libraries. Through 5-year plans, which perhaps as some of you know are required through the Library Services and Construction Act, a federal act, but plans which are also required, at least in our state, for our own state administrative agency. These kinds of plans in the library field have led very specifically to interlibrary loan arrangements. We have in our state a system of connected services in the libraries, which link together the 22 library systems, 9 reference libraries throughout the state, the libraries which are in the corporate and industrial agencies, and in fact the school libraries. And through pilot projects and very specific incentives that have been offered by state action, we are trying to encourage these kinds of collaborative efforts. They mean collaborative book selection through meetings in order to determine where the best purchases might be made for different institutions. They mean sharing collections by teletype messages and exchange of materials. I think I need not elaborate what the potential is by way of certain connections among the museums. Let me give you a third example, again where autonomy among institutions or agencies is prized, and yet where cooperation has been very important, and that is with public television. There happen to be within New York 9 different public television councils. Each one is a separate body, and yet they have been joined together through their own choice, so that in concert they can assist one another in programming, and in fact from time to time they formally join in a network arrangement so that a broadcasting one is simultaneously seen throughout the state on the other public television councils. But perhaps more important as one thinks about competition for resources is the fact that since there has been this kind of collaboration, there has been a joint effort which has increased appropriations at the state level for public television to the amount of some $10 million a year in subsidy for those operations. And I might note, if you're interested in statistical change, that while television viewing of these public councils in New York was at 500,000 weekly viewers back in 1965, the comparable figure today is 8 million. That's an enormous exchange or change of numbers, and it's in large part due to a networking effort. In the elementary and secondary schools, there are similar efforts at networking. These, not unique to our state, but in many different locations, especially where there's a formal regional network. Not only networking among the institutions, but there too, the museums and other cultural institutions. Of course, there are many, many examples of networking that already exist among the museums in our state, throughout the nation. And there are examples which go way back. Some of the oldest and most successful of the ventures are the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit Service, the Traveling Exhibit Service of the American Federation of Arts, and New York State's extension program through the Gallery Association of New York, supported by the Council on the Arts. Computer networks and other local services have been developed. I would hope, though, that as a follow-through of some examples in other areas, it might be worth the pursuit of seeing what has been done over 20 or 25 years in public television or libraries or with colleges and universities that may lend itself toward a further cooperation and networking with museums. If in fact there is to be a very genuine sharing of resource, if networking models are going to be valid for museums, it seems to me that 5 principles must be followed. And let me close by noting them and then inviting your discussion on them. The first one is the recognition that cultural institutions are more alike than different, and that while their size and their character and missions may well vary, they share generically similar concerns: collection, maintenance, and development, storage, conservation, cataloging, educational programming, exhibition and research, fundraising, fiscal management. They're issues for each and every institution. What must be explored is the concept that systematic approaches to these separate pieces, in fact, are logical and financially attractive. Secondly, a shared understanding that in times of decreasing resources, coupled with increasing demands for service and accountability for the use of public funds, collaboration is healthier for the museum field than is competition. Traditional barriers among institutions must in many ways be replaced with different strategies for resource sharing. Rational collaboration between institutions made not only more attractive to traditional funding sources, but to encourage new sources. I've tried to point out that this has in fact occurred with libraries and public television, and it certainly is occurring with schools and colleges and universities, where the incentives in grants are moving toward multi-institutional programs. The third point, there needs to be systematic assessment and ranking of local or regional museum concerns and objectives, so that there can be a focus on which are the most important things to be done. Fourth, cooperative beginnings need to be made at various organizational levels to find the links which are most immediately productive. At first, for example, natural links can be fostered as they have been in small historical agencies or societies, where there's a close parallel of institutional size, mission, or need. Very often there's already a working relationship where one can be developed. But then you have examples where there's very different types of institutions. Cataloging system requirements of a small historical society and a large art institution are certainly quite different. And yet it may be that certain cooperation that has to do with the more mundane administrative tasks, such as payroll systems, shared consultants, cooperative purchasing, or institutional collection storage, may be mutually beneficial. And there's certainly nothing wrong with beginning a link by going that route. And finally, communication networks must be strengthened, as we've tried to do in our own conferences, so that the data concerning museum activities is gathered, is collated, and is disseminated in a much more explicit way. In this way, successes can be shared more effectively and replicated much more readily. The many different kinds of funding programs now available at the federal and at the state, and indeed foundation levels, have for the most part in the past tended not to try to encourage networking or multi-institutional activities. And I submit that if indeed that's the kind of route that must be taken, it is certainly time for a reassessment of those kinds of funding patterns, to make a conscious determination that to encourage collaboration or networking is built in to the matter of making grants. May I close with a story which I hope might illustrate what I've been trying to say about stronger commitment, the basis, if you will, of trust and faith, which is necessary to begin networking. It is a story of a person who had ambitions of being one of the great tightrope walkers of this world. That man warmed up on the smaller jobs and finally did the task of going between the towers of the World Trade Center on his way toward the climax, which was going to be to go across the Niagara Falls on a tightrope. In addition to walking the rope, he was also pushing a wheelbarrow in front of him. If you can imagine, for purposes of the drama of the story, the day came and it was a terrible stormy day, making the task even more difficult. But this chap did, in fact, start out from one side and took the trip across, got to the other side, and there was quite a crowd assembled, cheering on this feat. That is, all were cheering except two. And they stepped from different parts of the crowd and took a good look at him. One of them said, "You know, that really wasn't very much. We know you've got ambitions, but you really haven't shown what you can quite do. Why don't you take and turn that wheelbarrow around and go back the other way and show us what you can do?" He said nothing. The other chap who stepped forward, practically the same tone, said, "We know your ambition is high, and we think that was really quite a remarkable feat, but we want to see if you could do it again. Why don't you follow this advice and turn that wheelbarrow around and go back the other direction?" Without saying anything at first, the chap, in fact, did pick up the handles of the wheelbarrow. He put it on the rope. He turned and put his foot on the first step of the rope, and then back over his shoulder said, "Gentlemen, if you care to get in, I'm ready to go." And I think by way of illustrating cooperation or networking as we look through this next decade, perhaps that kind of example that has to be in our minds. I thank you very much, and I'll be pleased to respond.
Thank you, Commissioner Ambach. We do have a few minutes, and there may have been some issues raised that are fairly provocative or have raised some questions or concerns in your mind. Now's the opportunity to address those and to ask Commissioner Ambach about them. If you do have questions, we ask or comments, we'd ask that you would come to the mic and pose your questions at the microphone.
I'm not sure that I can elaborate much on your point. It certainly is an important one. I've tried to sprinkle through my remarks some rather simple ways in which you can begin to get some kind of discussions and some kind of networking collaboration going. And that, in my book, is the only way to really do it. The question is whether changes of this sort can come just from within institutions, or whether in fact you've got to have a catalytic force outside to try to spur them on. I think that if I were to look at the examples in the library area, or the examples in the public television area, to take two, for the most part, the attempts at changing and networking came from within those organizations, not necessarily from a pressure from outside, but a desire that to meet fiscal problems or to provide more extensive services. It just made a lot more sense to go on interlibrary loans, for example, with library programs, or a lot more sense to try to develop certain programming combinations where one station would produce certain programs and another station would produce other programs. That strays a bit, I think, from your central point of attitudes, but I guess I'd go back and say that by way of changing attitudes, you change them by way of having successes. If you have a lot of failures by way of attempts to try to get together, it doesn't get anybody along. But if you have certain small successes, I think that's the best way to try to move along toward bigger and bigger events. And taking a small step should certainly not be denigrated at all.
Commissioner, I wonder if you might speak about purchasing consortiums. In your experience, have you found a certain size to be more effective than another? Can you illustrate for us?
I'm trying to think of a very specific example. I can comment in a general way that, for example, in our state there are state contractual arrangements, so that when certain items are bid on a statewide basis, and then institutions can tap in and purchase on that state contract price, which makes a considerable difference on the purchase of a particular item. Now that happens to be a very large joint purchasing arrangement, if you will, or a way in which to try to get a reasonable price. I am not personally specifically aware of examples in the museum field where I could give you a very concrete instance of a particular purchasing practice. Perhaps there are others who were here who have been engaged just in that and have managed to do it. But maybe my example of the overall state purchasing arrangement for some things would be of help to you. Do you want to follow up on that? Or does anybody want to comment by way of an example where this has been found? Yes.
In our small city, we have had in New York State, we have no real success in networking museums for many of the problems that have been outlined. But we have developed what's called, and you'll have to excuse this title, it is the high-level pretentiousness of the world, a third sector consortium, which involves two small colleges, the hospital, and the Boys Club, the mental health institution, and the museum. Now, these unlike organizations have come together in our third sector, and the third sector meaning the nonprofit sector, and have focused as our first project on purchasing as a mechanism for joint cooperation, and have found that it is, there are so many like problems, even between such disparate things as a museum and a hospital, that we have been able to advance the entire networking idea through just working on the problems of how joint purchasing can come about. Now, the details of what we're doing are so boring that I won't go into them right now, because there is nothing I have found quite as boring as purchasing. But I hope we can take that off the tape, because I think that's really a confession that I'll only give to colleagues, but it has worked. We have had, within the 6 months of the consortium, knowledge about the network of state contracts for which we didn't even know we were eligible until the expensive personnel at the colleges and hospitals really helped us get into the system. So we've saved a lot of money. We thought that we were doing everything wrong, but we did, when we finally got into this, our guilt feelings have been somewhat modified, because we find that we're only doing things a little worse than anyone else, not very much worse. But the most important thing is that this third sector has brought about increased cooperation among the cooperating institutions in a very dramatic way that goes beyond purchasing. For example, we are undertaking a joint closed-circuit television project with the hospital. They have a system and they need programming and so forth and so on, which would never have come about without this initial contact. And a joint system of financial management with the mental health organization, who found that our needs were very similar. So that from the small purchasing beginning, we are hoping that great things will grow within our third sector consortium.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is there any particular reason why it was made up of that broad variety of institutions? In other words, were there other cultural institutions that you could have linked up with, or are there other cultural institutions in that group? Because it's a very interesting approach to go at it from the nonprofit, that you have in common various kinds of needs and concerns, as opposed to being a group of cultural institutions that linked up.
The cultural institutions in our area, which are Westchester County, is very diverse. And the diversity among them is probably as less, I'm sure, much less than the diversity among the third sector group. But we have within the city, that is New Rochelle, we have a common purpose and a need. There was a need, there was greater, as Commissioner Ambach said, greater communication among this particular third sector group than there were among other more like institutions. And that's, I think, the reason for it. And because there are examples in cities throughout the country of such, I think Cleveland, and I can't remember the other places in which third sector groups have come together for their own and municipal benefit.
Thank you very much for that addition. Among the points that I hope you noticed there were cooperation with organizations which no one ever would have sat down in some kind of a perch chart or some kind of a planning document 10 years ago and said, we really ought to be thinking about how to put the hospital and that college and the museum together for this purpose. But it's happened. And there are all kinds of ways in which, in this case, for geographic location, or for an entity which is a political entity, a city, to bring together particular institutions. Sir?
Commissioner, I might just, if you allow me to mention the survey that the State Education Department did earlier, I guess it was late last year, on museums in New York State. And I suspect that if any member of this audience wants to see that, it's almost a model study, profile of museums in New York. You can get a copy, I suppose, by writing the State Education Department.
Certainly can. I think there are probably a few copies here. I have to say that because I had to draw so much on examples in New York, I held back on some examples. But this is a document which surveys all of the museum resources in New York State, and as a model that someone else might use by way of trying the same kind of survey, we'd be delighted to have a copy of it. I appreciate your...
I'd like to make a comment, perhaps you can comment on it. I've heard libraries mentioned previously as a precedent or something of a model that museums might emulate. And I think that the cooperation, of course, is fine, and we hope it will continue to develop in New York State. But the comparison is not altogether fair one. Simply because the infrastructure and the size of the amounts of public tax funding that goes into libraries is infinitely larger than that of museums. Museums are, for example, New York State are about 82% supported by private funds. 82% of museums receive private funds. So can you comment on the comparison of libraries and museums?
I would not press the analogy too hard that just what's been done with libraries can be done with museums. But I think it's instructive to note that if you go back before 1950 in our state, which is now 30 years ago, but if you go back before 1950, those interlibrary loan arrangements and those systems and that systematic connection among the libraries didn't exist in New York. So that it is not as if there's always been something there about libraries and library development which has made it quite different generically from what one might look at in museums. And there has been built over a period of 30 years not only the collaborative or networking structure, but also political clout, put it very bluntly, in the sense that by way of networking with institutions like libraries, it helps to draw together people not only with their regular operational functions, but also by way of their contacts with one another that laps over into the political area or the advocacy or lobbying effort by way of trying to draw additional resources. And so I think it's quite natural that what you see over the time of interlibrary loans and networking being developed is this kind of structure of advocacy, which then in fact brings back results by way of increased resources. I think one can find that example in our state at any rate with the libraries over this period, and I know that you can find this very explicitly with television councils over the course of the last 15 to 20 years within the state of New York. I mentioned the 9 different councils. Operating separately, each one has a particular region and therefore particular senators and assemblymen in that particular part of the state. Again, they use the political slant. But operating collectively, they reach every part of the entire state. And so that when one is looking at a formula aid program for public television in New York State, one is looking for a program which affects each and every senatorial or assembly district in the entire state. That's a lesson which perhaps is very obvious, but I think it's worth continuing to pound on. You don't have any such kind of arrangement with respect to funding for museums. You have categorical funding in our state through the State Council on the Arts, but you don't have, for example, any formula funding, which is the kind of glue, if you will, that can draw a networking effort or collaborative effort together when it comes around to advocacy at a statewide level.
One comment and one question. Since the question was raised about the success or precedence for purchasing jointly, and I just mentioned one effort that didn't work in the hopes that we can learn as much from failure as we can from success. The potential for a joint purchasing program was looked at in the state of Maine, with the possibility of the State Museum serving as a central purchasing agency for upwards of 150 local museums and historical societies. It was decided not to go ahead with this because in doing a cost analysis, it developed that although purchases in quantity could be made at a substantial saving, somebody would have to be responsible for storing the stuff. Somebody would have to be responsible for making up orders, for the billings that were involved, for arranging transportation, etc. And at least in our geographic area, we were able to confirm the fact that there's a good reason for a wholesale-retail price differential. And it appeared that unless there were an institution able and willing to absorb the costs, the real costs, of taking wholesale lots, breaking them down, and distributing them at retail, that it was not economically feasible to do that. It might work out in a metropolitan area, however. One question that I'd like to pose. Responses that I've got in trying to serve as an advocate for networking and cooperative efforts on the state level have often involved a question and a concern to the effect that at some point, as we go down this road, we're going to get into the area in which institutions have given up certain functions, perhaps to the point where they cease to be viable institutions. It's possible to conceive of a situation in which many museums have given up their curatorial staff because some agency somewhere is able to provide this on a centralized basis, have given up their cataloging functions because some agency somewhere is able to provide it on a centralized basis. Is there any danger that you see or any examples that you see among libraries and other institutions that have done networking, that there is some point, are there danger signals, is there a potential for this type of thing in which institutions actually give up some of their essential viability in the process of gaining through joint cooperative effort?
I certainly would agree with you that the difficulty or the danger is ever present. I cannot provide for you what I think you're really looking for, and that is what would be the danger signals at what particular point in networking efforts do you stop so that you don't really put in jeopardy the independence or the autonomy of a particular institution. And I'm not sure that one could really create that set of criteria so that it would be too useful. We might be able to create it in an academic or abstract sense, but whether it really had application to a particular institution, I'm not sure. I would say that one looks at the television area and the question of the autonomy or independence of a particular local television council. The issue there is one of how fast is, or how soon is it that cable overtakes them all? In the sense that if you can take New York State with 9 different councils, if you had on cable access to 25 or 30 channels, and you had all your commercial broadcast circuits out of New York City or whatnot available every place in the state, including public televisions in some parts of the state available in other parts of the state, how long is it before you're really in a danger that the public television councils are in competition with one another and just, in fact, would absorb them? That's a technical problem, if you will. It's not just a question of desirability of getting together or whatnot, but the fact that cable is just going to do that in the area of television. There, in fact, I guess one might argue that the reasons for networking, and networking very carefully, would be precisely to avoid a rather open circumstance that you got all the television signals from all the public stations out and inundating an area, therefore destroying the local usefulness of a particular council. For the libraries, I don't think that we've seen any particular danger points by way of the interlibrary arrangements in the state. Maybe there will be more danger points coming up as the problem of book purchasing and the matter of really using union catalogs and systems where we know that there are certain books here but they're not there. You're using those for purposes of deciding which library is going to have the collection and which library isn't going to have. Those decisions are going to have to be made much more regularly coming up in the next 10 years. I would assume those would be the same kinds of decisions which would come on the museums. Perhaps not so much in the sense of which particular artifact would be purchased, but perhaps which would be restored or which is particularly handled, or which particular part of your collection do you use on display or get ready for a special display, as against what's going on in the other museums around. That seems to me could become a matter of concern. But my hunch is that we've got so much distance to go by way of building networking arrangements that those kinds of dangerous signals are not right around the corner. They're well down, and I think they can be dealt with at a later time. The earlier kinds of steps, the specific example for which was described just a few moments ago, and other early steps are not going to take us off the edge of the diving board right away, and I think into a dry pool. Yes, sir.
My own remarks or comment, maybe it's more comment than it is a question, have to do with survival of museums or any other institution. What institutions have to do with threat to their survival. And perhaps museums, like other institutions historically, won't collaborate or work together more than they do unless or until their survival as a whole is threatened. In your construction of this department or bureau or secretary of culture, it was interesting that you, or what you put in it and what you left out of it. And perhaps you were looking at the realities of life and why you would leave the Golden Goose, Smithsonian out, and put the Museum Service Institute in, leave the Museum Act out, and not put the endowments in. Confused me a bit, but when I get a chance to look at your paper, I'll be able to see the rhyme and the reason behind what you put in and what you left out. My second point is that in your beginning of opening comments, you gave such great adulation and praise to museums. And I hadn't expected, I thought, some very insightful comments regarding the bigotry, the racism that runs rampant in museums throughout this country, their inability to tell the truth about American history, about American people, the history of the world, needless to say, the history of America, is one of struggle and survival and facing struggle together. And when you go into many of our museums, we have created antiseptic, sanitized presentations on history that hardly speak of truth, honesty, historic honesty. And perhaps some kind of collaboration could be developed in the area of universities and museums where the vast majority of museum people in America, I would submit, are untrained people. And maybe universities can help develop programs to train people, maybe beginning with the simple tenet of honesty, backed up by historical authenticity, how to do good research, how to be good conservators, and how to be good education officers in museums. But philosophically, museums face such tremendous problems in terms of looking at modern day circumstances and situations. And I've indicated to you the line that goes on in terms of past history. Anybody who, I would suggest like yourself, who could be a commissioner of education and not recognize these glaring inadequacies and praise museums the way you have is somewhat disturbing.
Thank you for your comment. Certainly did not mean to imply that there is not room for improvement. I wanted to acknowledge the fact that as a personal experience, there have been some very good ones. I would, by way of adding to your comment in a very constructive form, note and commend you for the observation of a closer link between the colleges and universities and the museums. I think that's an important point. It's something that we are explicitly trying to do with our own state museum. I would invite your joining us and looking at some of our collections and addressing the very issues that you're speaking to, by way of the honesty of approach in the telling of the story of American history. If I might just go back to the very first point that you made on the question of the organization at the federal level. You have quite rightly noted that there are some items in and some items out. The recommendation I have presented was not intended to try to remake the entire federal structure for purposes of working with museums or other cultural institutions. It's a much more modest suggestion than that. It in fact deals very particularly with the issue that is an issue before the Secretary of how the pieces currently within the Department of Education are organized, something that's a very key and current problem, with the question of certain other items which are at the federal level, which in my judgment right now do not have a sound enough footing in themselves and might more properly be connected. I do not feel the same way about the items that have been left out of that design, but I would acknowledge, as you have pointed out, that's quite a modest and I think quite practical presentation as to what is the next step and not necessarily what would be the final step. Yes, sir.
To follow up on the gentleman's comments, especially in terms of survival, one of the things that is obviously necessary for the survival of most museums is money.
Right.
And I would think that surely there must be some programs. I think address this to Cheryl, if anybody's here from IMS. Are there any programs that are granting agencies or types of grants that are available to museums that are specifically interested in networking projects? I think one way of providing some incentive to network projects is obviously dollars.
You're right.
And I think one of the questions that this gentleman raised has directly to do with money. It has to do with a number of other things, but money, of course, is very important. And before you answer, Cheryl, let me just make one comment. I work for an institution that has no permanent collection. We have 60,000 square feet of exhibit space on our main floor, and we do a large number of traveling exhibits. All of this is done by borrowing primarily, heavily from collections that other institutions have. Most of you have more problems with storage than anything else. We have no storage space, a very good production facility, so it's we get something, you get something. Now, if someone would like to ask my question. Thank you.
I don't want to dwell on this since this isn't the session on federal support, but the answer to your first question is yes, that I think the federal agencies and even members of the private sector are looking at the notion of sharing, the notion of cooperation because of their own financial situation, that with a decreasing dollar and with the inflationary factor that's facing our own constituents, but with an increasing interest in trying to support the projects that museums want to do, but to still foster means of working together, that kind of language is creeping into the guidelines. And more and more you want to see that it's not only creeping language, but that it will be very out front, and it will say that priority will be given to institutions that are fostering efforts to work together. I can't really speak for my colleagues in other federal agencies, but I know that one of the obvious instances of that in the museum program at NEH is sharing collection resources, which speaks to the second part, where you have an institution that does not have a permanent collection, but has the interest and the capability of doing exhibitions and similar kinds of activities, that kind of a project can foster relationships between institutions that have collections that are underutilized or that are unutilized, and can cause organizations and institutions to work together that probably would never have worked together except under those circumstances. I do believe that the Arts Endowment is beginning to, and is already looking at this kind of networking support. And I'm not so sure about the Institute of Museum Services. I know that with their special project support that they have spoken more specifically about relationships between museums and educational institutions, which doesn't speak so directly to your first one. But I think, yes, you're beginning to see that because of the need on the part of the constituents and the equal need on the part of the funding sources as well, to use their money more efficiently.
Yes, ma'am.
Suzanne Forrest, ex-museum director, now executive director of the Wyoming Council for the Humanities. And I'd like to speak on the possible role that state humanities programs can play in this respect. In some states, the State Museum Association offers as a benefit of membership the fact that they apply for grants for apply for grants to the State Humanities Program, and with it then make available traveling exhibits that can travel to these small museums that are not capable of creating their own exhibits. There is talk about expanding this on a regional level. The State Humanities Programs are just at the beginning of this. I can't say that we've progressed very far because there are problems of coordinating guidelines and deadlines and getting our various councils and committees to agree on what they want in the way of criteria. But I think it's coming. And I think in the West, this is very important because in the West we have some very outstanding museums with fine collections and the capability of producing very fine exhibits. And we have lots of small museums that do not have these capabilities. And what I personally would like to see, and I think I'm not alone out there, to see this kind of cooperation where the museums that have the capability think not only in terms of perhaps producing an exhibit not only for their own institution or their state, but perhaps making it available on a wider scale and having it funded jointly by more than one state through their humanities programs. I think with encouragement from the museum profession, this is something that can be developed.
Thank you very much for your addition. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to move in right after that and point out that there are about 20 or slightly over 20 states within the United States that do have traveling exhibitions programs that operate on the state level. Many of these exhibitions are small, inexpensive, and they do come from the various institutions within that state. They're very often operated by a single museum or out of a state arts agency. And it's wonderful to hear that the humanities component is offered now. I'd like to point
associations or out-of-state arts councils that are very active in networking consultants and technical assistants throughout their states to a variety of museums and others.
May I just briefly comment on basically the nuts and bolts of cooperation? And I think initially the thing that people have to realize is that people get together because they're interested primarily for their own sake. And that this interest or goal and objectives have to be clearly stated, and the roles and duties of each individual and each organization has to be clearly stated. If it's not, cooperation eventually breaks down and somebody's left holding the bag.
Well put. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very kindly for joining in this session. I hope that perhaps from the perspective of some of the other areas of educational and cultural institutions, that there may be some examples of ways in which the interest of museums can be further developed. Thank you.